Thank you very much. Welcome to EPA's monthly webinar series for small systems. Today's topic is funding opportunities through EPA's drinking water program. A few logistical things up front before we get to get to our speakers. You can find the webinar slides in the dialog box on your screen under handouts. So it's listed as EPA Small System Webinar Series Slides. You can find the slides there if you'd like to peruse the slides on your own. Also, if you have a question at any time during the talks about the material, go to the questions box in that dialog box and please type your question in. And if you can type it in at that moment, that would be great. It would help us organize the questions that we will then ask after the second speaker is done. So we'll go through the first speaker, Dallas Shattuck, and then Alyssa Edwards. And then after Alyssa, we'll handle all questions, and we usually run somewhere around till 3:15 to 3:30 Eastern Time. Also, if you need some support for whatever reason, there's an email address right there that you can send a message to. And also, finally, we offer a certificate for 1 training hour for attending this webinar series. And the rules with regard to that, those training certificates, is that you must be registered or be in a room with someone who is. You must attend the webinar for the 60 minutes of presentations. If you're in a room with others, the people not logged in the names of the people not logged in must be provided by the person who is. You can type those names in the question box or send the names to the email address right there on the screen. If you did not request credit at registration, you can request it by responding to your registration confirmation email. So that's how the training certificates work. And a little note about upcoming webinars. So on December 5th, the lead service line identification and replacement webinar series will have a webinar on large public water systems. So please tune into that. And our small systems webinar series will have a presentation November 19th. So that's very shortly, just in a few weeks, on risk assessment, emergency response, and resiliency. So with that, we'll go on with the speakers. And one last thing, if you're in a room with somebody, if there's more than just yourself in a room, please type the number of people that are in the room and put that into the question box. We then can log in how many people are attending this webinar, and that helps us justify the importance of this webinar series for future funding to put on these webinars. So if you could put the number of people in your room, that would help us quantitate how many people are actually in attendance, because we don't see that data. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so getting right into our first talk. Our first speaker will be Dallas Shattuck. Dallas is a physical scientist with the EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. She works on a variety of projects, including the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program, and with a primary focus on helping implement and oversee the American iron and steel requirements for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. She has a bachelor's degree from St. Francis University and a master's degree from George Washington University. And with that, I'll hand the podium to Dallas.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So I am going to give a talk on the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and primarily, is my screen frozen? Oh, there we go. Sorry, everybody. So for a quick overview, I just want to give a quick history of the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program. I'm going to talk about the different components of the DWSRF briefly, the major components, and then I wanted to end by going over some of the recent changes to the program through the America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018. So starting with the history, so the Drinking Water SRF was created in 1996. It is in the Safe Drinking Water Act. It was in the 1996 amendments. It's section 1452, and it was modeled after the successful Clean Water State Revolving Fund program, which was written into the Clean Water Act in the 1980s. And it is a federal-state partnership that is designed to create in all of the states a permanent source of financing for drinking water infrastructure projects. So that was our quick history. And then I want to talk about some of the components of the DWSRF. So what is the Drinking Water SRF program? First and foremost, it is a public health protection program. And we achieve this goal through the financing of drinking water infrastructure projects. So we just like to emphasize that we are a public health protection program first and foremost. And it has both infrastructure and non-infrastructure components. So the infrastructure component is meant to provide, as I already mentioned, a permanent source of infrastructure funding to water systems. But not all drinking water issues can be solved with new infrastructure. So this is where the non-infrastructure component comes in, and we refer to that as the set-asides. And the set-asides provide support to both state programs and communities. And there are 4 set-asides that states can utilize, and in a few slides, I'm going to talk about each of those in more detail. So this is our infrastructure model. It starts in the top left, where Congress appropriates funding for the Drinking Water SRF. It comes to EPA, and then EPA awards capitalization grants, is what we call them, to each state for their Drinking Water SRF program based on the results of the latest Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey, which EPA conducts every 4 years. And at this time, this is when states can also take set-aside funds if they choose to. So after they take their set-asides, the remaining balance of the capitalization grant, along with a 20% match from the state, is put into the revolving loan fund, which we see in the middle of the screen. And then this revolving fund provides loans and other types of assistance to water systems for eligible drinking water projects, which you can see going to the right, the low interest loans. And then the water systems, they can do these projects, they repay their loans, and then the repayments and the interest, they flow back into the revolving fund. So this is where the revolving part comes in, is they provide the loans, but then the interest and repayments are coming back in, and that eventually they'll be given out to new communities for other drinking water projects and to make additional loans. And then there are some states who have a lot of demand and not enough cash on hand, so they will go to the bond market and leverage their funds as a way to provide more assistance to water systems throughout the state. And then just one thing we like to note is that there are 51 state drinking water SRF programs. It's all 50 states plus Puerto Rico is considered a state under the Drinking Water SRF program, ergo 51. And while they all have the same basic framework, they operate and they target their funding more narrowly based on maybe different priorities or issues going on in their state. So states have a lot of flexibility in where they target their funding. Okay, so who is eligible for infrastructure funding? Eligible applicants includes publicly owned and privately owned community water systems, with the caveat, you can see it down on the bottom, that some states don't allow funding of private systems. But we like to mention that anyway because there are a lot of states who do. And then also, eligible applicants are nonprofit, non-community water systems. And these include places like schools, parks, churches, publicly owned campgrounds. And then I will just note that for a nonprofit system to be eligible for SRF funding, it must have a federal tax exempt status ID number. And then the box at the bottom is pretty important. Water systems need to have the technical, managerial, and financial capacity in their system in order to receive infrastructure assistance from the drinking water SRF. And for systems who don't have capacity in all three areas, this is where the set-asides can come in, and we're going to talk about those in a few minutes, and it can help systems achieve that capacity, which then they can go and get a loan from the Drinking Water SRF Infrastructure Fund. So there are a variety of projects that are eligible under the Infrastructure Fund. We have treatment, transmission and distribution, water storage, some types of source projects, consolidation and regionalization, creating new systems in some cases. And I will say that historically, the majority of our funding has been for treatment and transmission and distribution projects. But we also like to tell everybody that if states know of a project that appears ineligible, but the project would meet a critical public health need, to just reach out to EPA, your regions, and then they can come to headquarters. We're always willing to talk about new ideas. So we are open to new ideas, and we are here to listen. So if you have ideas, please bring them to us. So what is eligible in terms of project costs? So the first bullet is, materials, labor, things related for the project. And then there are also some additional costs that people may not realize, like land acquisition, if it's needed for the purpose of locating an eligible project and the land is acquired from a willing seller, that's important. Restructuring costs for systems in significant noncompliance with, primary drinking water regulations, or those who have issues with technical, financial, and managerial capacity to ensure compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And then there are also planning and design costs, because funding, planning, and design can help projects become ready to proceed and go to construction and be completed more quickly. Okay, on to the set-asides. So the inclusion of the set-asides in the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program, which are preventative non-infrastructure assistance, was Congress's recognition that not all drinking water problems can be fixed with new or improved infrastructure. So the set-asides are a critical central component of the program. They provide additional tools for states to help them achieve CDWA's public health protection objectives, and they should be strategically focused on a variety of areas. They complement the infrastructure financing. They strengthen the public water supervision system program, public water system supervision program, I said that backwards. And they help implement preventative CDWA programs like source water protection, capacity development, and operator certification. So this is a breakdown of our 4 set-asides. I'm just going to go over them quickly, and I have a few examples of what can be funded under each set-aside. So we have the 2%. So states can set aside up to 2% of their capitalization grant for technical assistance to small water systems. So water systems with under 10,000 people. And it can be used for things like providing third-party contractors assistance to the system, or the program directly helping the small system in applying for drinking water SRF funding. And we have the 4% set aside, which is what we call it, but some amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act kind of changed it where it's not always exactly 4%. So the 4% can either be up to 4% of the capitalization grant, $400,000, or 0.2% of the loan fund total value, whichever is greater. The state can choose whichever method they would like. And that is for administration of the drinking water SRF and technical assistance to water systems. So this one's most commonly used for, states administering the drinking water SRF program, so some staffing and maybe marketing and outreach materials. The 10% is related to the PWSS program. and that helps them administer their PWSS and source water protection programs, and it also helps them to implement capacity development and operator certification programs. And then the last one that we have is the 15% set aside, which this one, there are a lot of different things that are eligible under this one, but the main ones we have listed below. So they can provide loans to acquire land or conservation easements for the purposes of source water protection, or there can be loans to implement voluntary source water protection measures. There are also some capacity development eligibilities under the 15% set aside, and it can also be used to implement and establish a wellhead protection program and for a variety of source water protection activities. Okay, so I mentioned some examples on the last slide of what the set-asides can be used for, but there are a lot of ways that the set-asides can be used, and in these gears, you just see some of the ways that it can be used: managing data, restructuring, getting a project ready, source water protection. We just like to emphasize that there are a lot of different things that the set-asides can be used for. They can help communities in a lot of different ways, and they all work together to help communities achieve the public health goals of the Safe Drinking Water Act. Okay, so this is a quick, I guess, update on the Drinking Water SRF. So what have we done since we were implemented in the late 90s? So since 1997, we have turned $19 billion in capitalization grants, which is like taxpayer investment, into over $38 billion in assistance to projects. So that is like we've signed $38 billion into loans. And of note, 35% of that assistance has been to small systems, which is pretty significant. We have given out approximately 14,500 loans signed since the beginning of the program. And this is interesting, 70% of those loans have been to small communities. So essentially, we give more loans out to small systems, but it's typically for smaller amounts than maybe a bigger system would need. But the majority of our loans do go to small systems. And then $33 billion has been dispersed to projects to improve drinking water infrastructure in communities. So the Drinking Water SRF is a repayment program. So we've signed $38 billion into loans, and then $33 billion of that has actually been incurred project costs where the community has come back for reimbursement. And then in terms of the set-asides, states have taken $3.2 billion to use for non-infrastructure capacity building and prevention-focused set-asides. So it's helped them implement cost-effective projects, protect their source water, certify their operators, and ensure that drinking water systems in their state have technical, managerial, and financial capacity. Okay. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was some recent changes to the program through America's Water Infrastructure Act, which I'm just going to call AWIA from now on, of 2018. So the main three changes to the Drinking Water SRF through the 2018 amendments is that the program was reauthorized, and it also provided more flexibilities to assist small and disadvantaged communities. And then it also expanded source water protection areas under the Drinking Water SRF set-asides. So, just a summary of AWIA. It amended the Safe Drinking Water Act, Section 1452, which is the DWSRF section. This is only the second major amendment since the Drinking Water SRF's enactment 22 years ago. There was also a amendment in 2016, the WIN Act, that made some amendments to the Drinking Water SRF program. So in general, AWIA authorized extended infrastructure loan terms. It required the provision of additional subsidy to disadvantaged communities as defined by the state. And like I said, it expanded source water protection related eligibilities under the 15% set aside. So I'm just going to touch on this section briefly, but after OEA, the OEA amendments, the section of the DWSRF now requires states to use at least 6%, but no more than 35% of their capitalization grant for additional subsidy. Essentially, that's free money for state-defined disadvantaged communities. And that's important because before OEA, the range was 0% through 30%. So there were some states that didn't have disadvantaged community programs. So essentially, OEA mandated that all states now needed to create one if they didn't already have one, and give at least 6% of that grant to disadvantaged communities as free money. And for most states, this is going to start applying for their 2019 CAP grant. And the additional subsidy must be in the form of a loan. So it either has to be principal forgiveness or a negative interest loan, but it cannot be a grant. And then another big change was increased flexibility on loan terms. So before OEA, the maximum loan period was 20 years for a DWSRF eligible recipient or 30 years for a disadvantaged community. But OEA extended those terms, and now it's 30 years for a DWSRF eligible recipient or up to 40 years for a state-defined disadvantaged community, or the design life of the project, whichever is shorter. So if the design life of the project is 27 years, then the community should not be getting a 40-year loan. And then it also extends the loan repayment initiation up to 18 months after the project's completed, which before OEA, it was 12 months after the project was completed. Okay, and then I touched on this a little bit, but source water protection activities are eligible under the 15% set aside. We talked about a few of those eligibilities, like the land acquisition loans and voluntary source water protection initiatives. But amendments under OEA now allow states to fund delineation and assessment of source water protection areas. They can update their existing source water protection assessments using the 15% set aside, which is interesting because that authorization previously expired in 1997. So Congress reauthorized that, and they put that back in there. And then further, the states can use the 15% set aside to fund activities to implement source water protection more generally. So there are a lot more options for source water protection activities under that set aside than there were previously. And then finally, I just have a few bullets on other items that people might be interested in. So the drinking water SRF was reauthorized, and we got increased authorization amounts up to $1.9 billion in fiscal year 21. So it doesn't mean that we will get that much, but Congress has authorized us to get up to $1.95 billion. And then Davis-Bacon's just one of our requirements, and that was added in the Drinking Water SRF as permanent, even though it already was somewhere else, but they just put it in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And the American Iron and Steel requirements, which is a domestic preference requirement, and that's what I work on, that was made, that was extended from fiscal year 2019 through fiscal year 2023. It had been extended on an annual basis, but Congress decided to make it for 4 years. And then the drinking water needs surveys, they need to include an estimate of replacement costs for lead service lines, both the public and private portions. And EPA is also required to collect state best practices on administrating the drinking water SRF program and disseminating that to states within 3 years. And that is it for me. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, Dallas.
Thank you.
So we have our next presenter coming on soon, but before we do, a couple of housekeeping duties again. If you have a question for our speakers, for Dallas or Alyssa, please put them in the question box and we can organize them for at the end of, and we'll answer all questions at the end of the second talk. And the other thing is, if you haven't already, and there's more than one room, please put the number of people in your room in a message to us in the question box. It helps us quantitate how many people are attending the webinar, and then we can use that to show the value of this webinar series. So with that, I will introduce our second speaker for the day. Alyssa Edwards is an environmental protection specialist with the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. She's at the EPA's headquarters in Washington, D.C., and she's the lead on the Assistance for Small and Disadvantaged Communities Drinking Water Grant program. Alyssa also provides support on various capacity development efforts, including being a project officer for a technical assistance for small systems grants. Alyssa has a bachelor's from UC Santa Cruz and 2 master's degrees, one from American University and the other from Florida International. And with that, I'll hand over the podium to Alyssa.
Great, thank you so much, Tom, and welcome everybody to the webinar, and thanks for your interest in the Assistance for Small and Disadvantaged Communities Drinking Water Grant. So a little bit about the grant, an overview on the grant. You've heard already about the Safe Drinking Water Act. So Section 1459A of the Safe Drinking Water Act, it was amended by the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act in 2016. And also, too, as you've heard about AWIA, America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018. And those amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act authorized the EPA to award grants to states to assist underserved, small and disadvantaged communities that are unable to finance activities needed to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act, as well as for a state to respond to a drinking water contaminant situation. The grant includes approximately $42.8 million in funding for 2019. So for shorthand, I'll be referring to the Safe Drinking Water Act as CDWA. So the CDWA Section 1459A, what it does is it authorizes EPA to award grants to states on behalf of an underserved community. So that's critical there, that EPA is making the decision to award grants to states, and by that statutory requirement, that means that all the communities served must meet this underserved community criteria, statutory criteria. So the term underserved community, by the statute, it includes a political subdivision of a state that either A, does not have household drinking water or wastewater services, or B, is served by a public water system that violates or exceeds, as applicable, a requirement of a national primary drinking water regulation, including a maximum containment level, a treatment technique, and an action level. So again, that underserved community definition, it's either A or B, as you're seeing on your screen right now. In addition to that, the Safe Drinking Water Act, or CDWA Section 1459A, has a definition for small and disadvantaged communities. So the term small and disadvantaged is specified in the statute as a community that A, under affordability criteria established by the state under Section 1452D3 of the Safe Drinking Water Act, is determined by the state to be a disadvantaged community, or to be a community that may become a disadvantaged community as a result of carrying out a project or activity under this grant program, or B, with a population of less than 10,000 individuals that the administrator determines does not have the capacity to incur debt sufficient to finance a project or activity under this grant program. And here, the term administrator, that's referring to the EPA administrator, and you'll notice there that note at the bottom of the slide pointing out that EPA is going to defer to states to identify which of their small communities lack the capacity to incur debt to finance a project and those communities that can most benefit from this funding opportunity. So again, EPA is awarding grants under this program to states on behalf of their underserved communities. And those underserved communities, the next step of that criteria is being either small or disadvantaged. We have gotten that question, do the communities need to meet both the small and disadvantaged? So it's either that criteria A, small, where you see on your slide, you see the ors there after each statement. So either that A, about disadvantaged, or B, in terms of the statutory definition of small. The eligible applicants, as I've mentioned, EPA is awarding this funding to states. So the funds are going to be awarded non-competitively to the states, which includes the 50 states, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. And also, too, I wanted to mention there's an implementation document for state funding that is available online, and that's at epa.gov/safewater/grants. And that's where you can not only find the implementation document, but a range of information, including when we have webinars, fact sheets, frequently asked questions, and other items that may be of interest. So the allocation of funds. Funding is going to be awarded based on a formula similar to that of the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. There is funding dedicated for as a tribal allotment, and that's going to be 2% of the funds are going to be allocated as a tribal allotment. The regional tribal allotment is calculated according to the Drinking Water Infrastructure Grants tribal set-aside formula. And again, more information about the tribal allotment for the grant program can be found on our website as well. Eligible activities that can be funded under this grant program include investments necessary for a public water system to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act, efforts that benefit a disadvantaged community on a per household basis, programs to provide household water quality testing, including testing for unregulated contaminants. We know unregulated contaminants are a significant concern for a number of communities and for a number of the states. So there is that caveat in the statutory language that funding from this program can be used to address unregulated contaminants. And also, too, another area of eligible activities for funding are those activities necessary and appropriate for a state to respond to a drinking water contaminant. So some further details about those activities, some potential projects that can be considered for funding include treatment projects, transmission and distribution projects, storage, consolidation, household water quality testing, as I previously mentioned, assistance to increase technical, managerial, and financial capacity of public water systems, and again, drinking water contamination response efforts. Some examples, further examples underneath each of those categories of potential projects and activities include for treatment, that can be the construction of new facilities or portions of facilities, upgrades, rehabilitation, or replacement of facilities or portions of facilities, raw water storage that is part of the treatment process and located on the property where the treatment facility is located. And also, too, just that last bullet there, wanted to make sure you all were aware that point of access or point of use treatment devices, such as filters, are only eligible if the device is the compliance treatment technology and the device is owned and maintained by the public water system. Some examples of transmission and distribution activities that can be funded under this grant program include installation, replacement, or rehabilitation of infrastructure to improve water pressure to safe levels or to prevent contamination caused by non-potable liquids entering the system through leaks or pipe breaks, service line replacements regardless of the pipe material and ownership of the property on which the service line is located. We also want to make sure that you all are aware that partial replacement of lead service lines will not be permitted under this grant program. What will be considered in terms of eligibility as well are new water main extensions to serve existing residents not served by a safe supply of drinking water, and this includes installation of the service line up to premise plumbing. Some example storage activities include new storage or replacement, rehabilitation of existing structures to continue to maintain compliance and protect public health by preventing contaminants from entering a public water system, equalizing water demands, reducing pressure fluctuations in the system, providing reserves when there's emergencies or power outages, and providing drought resiliency. Some example consolidation activities include the purchase of a water system, interconnection of systems, and we want to make sure that all are aware as well is that related to that purchase of a water system, there are some limitations on how funding can be used for that. So we want to make sure, if you see in the note item, that funding from the grant program cannot be used to purchase land, easements, rights-of-way, or relocations. This is prohibited by the statute, by the language that actually authorizes this grant program under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Consolidation activities cannot be for growth purposes. However, deviations will be considered for water systems in small and disadvantaged communities to consolidate with existing systems that have the adequate technical, managerial, and financial capacity. Some examples of household water quality testing projects or activities include, again, testing for unregulated contaminants, conducting initial, special, non-routine monitoring to establish a baseline understanding of a contaminant, testing for potential contamination in drinking water wells or home systems, testing and analysis of household water through a compliance lab, and testing to help identify and improve conditions that may trigger drinking water well pollution. And again, that note there that you see there, that's related to the statutory requirements and what is prohibited use of funding by the statute. So according to the statute, funding from this grant program cannot be used for maintenance and operation purposes or for routine compliance monitoring and sampling. So that is important to keep in mind. Now, the range of technical, managerial, and financial capacity potential projects and activities is actually quite broad. That can be everything from training for system staff or board members, the lead service line inventories, which we understand are becoming increasingly important across the country, various water and energy audits, operator certification, rate evaluations and project development, drafting of source water protection ordinances, asset management, and rate evaluations and project development. Again, these are just some example activities. These lists are not all-inclusive, but we hope that this provides you a general foundation of some of the activities that can be funded through this grant program. And also, too, I mentioned about the drinking water contamination response efforts. So that actually is a category of activities and projects that was added on due to the amendments brought about through the America's Water Infrastructure Act, AWIA, which was mentioned earlier. So some potential activities that can be considered for funding include investigation of a suspected water contamination incident, planning activities for remediation, contaminant characterization, decontamination, and clearance activities, risk communication and public notification activities, and post-remediation monitoring to verify the removal of a drinking water contaminant. There are some ineligible activities as well. So there's some areas where funding from this grant program cannot be used. And that is, again, like I mentioned earlier, the purchase of land, easements, rights-of-way, and relocations. That's prohibited by the statute. Operations and maintenance costs, that's also a prohibited use of funding according to the statute. As already mentioned as well, partial lead service line replacement will not be considered under this grant program. Replacement of premise plumbing, such as faucets, will not be considered. However, private side lead service line replacement is eligible. Construction or rehabilitation of dams will not be an eligible use of funding for this grant program. And again, purchase of water rights are generally not going to be considered as eligible unless the water rights are owned by a system to be purchased for consolidation as part of a capacity development strategy. Ineligible activities also include the construction or rehabilitation of reservoirs, activities needed primarily for fire protection, activities needed primarily to serve future population growth, also activities that have already received assistance from the tribal allotment from this program will not be considered for additional funding since there's already that funding dedicated under that tribal allotment. And then, of course, costs that are not allowable according to the Code of Federal Regulations when it comes to grant programs. So we're making sure that for this grant program, we're still following all of the Code of Federal Regulations that are required across the board for our grants. So one thing that is quite significant for this program is by the statute, our applicants are required to pay not less than 45% of the total cost of the project or activity. So there are these significant cost share requirements. So again, that cost share requirement, that first one, it's 45%, and this is of the total cost of the project or activity. Also too, by the statute, one of the cost share requirements is to provide any land, easements, rights of way, and relocations necessary to carry out the project or activity. And that last item there is to pay 100% of any operation and maintenance costs associated with the project or activity. So again, these are quite significant. This is required by the statute for this grant program. So our next steps for the grant, and some of you are already familiar with some of these steps if you've been keeping an eye out on EPA's website or seen some of the press releases that have gone out this year. We had our implementation document for the state portion of this grant program that was released in September. Also, our applications are open on grants.gov. That happened in September. We want to make sure that also too, all are aware that our applications for this grant program are not closing until next year. So that's September of 2020. And the reason for that is that we know that 45% cost share requirement is going to be a significant lift for some of the states. And we want to make sure there's ample time for the states to come up with that cost share requirement to best serve the communities that can actively benefit from this grant program. Also too, what is underway actually is that states are currently working with our EPA regional staff on their work plans and also looking at potential list of activities and projects. And so that last item there, EPA is going to be funding projects through this grant program on a rolling basis as applications are submitted. And it is through our EPA regional offices that they are the primary points of contact to work with states on approving the grant applications, looking at those draft work plans, and awarding funding. So for additional information, I've already mentioned about keeping an eye on our website. So that's again, epa.gov/safewater/grants. On the website, you'll be able to find all of the EPA regional contacts by state and territory for this grant program. There's also your state and territory agency contacts. As I mentioned, this grant program, EPA is awarding funding directly to the states. So water systems or communities that are interested in accessing this funding will also need to reach out to your relevant state or territory agency to see about the possibility of accessing this funding through the state program. The state implementation document is available on the website as well. We have additional frequently asked questions. We have the grant program fact sheet and other materials. And if there are new materials developed, we will be adding those to the website as well. And as I mentioned, this program is being managed and awarded through the EPA regional offices. So what you see in front of you is a list of all of our EPA regional contacts by state and territory. This is the same information that you can also find on our website. But the EPA regional contacts are your first point of contact for general information about the grant program. And then the state and territory agencies are also your points of contact if you are a water system or a community that's interested in accessing this funding. And so I will go ahead and end there.